Now, things get really interesting when we decide to scale different aspects of these objects, right? And how to select different aspects of these objects. So one of the most important things to learn in 3D modeling is the difference between these types of editing modes. We can edit vertexes, edges, or lines. Vertexes are also known as kind of like points, edges and lines, or faces and planes. It's kind of moving between what's called object and component mode. Right now we've been in object mode. You kind of select the whole object and scale it or rotate it or move it. But if I right click on this object at any time, right now I'm in object mode. If I click object, it's the same way, right? But this is a shortcut menu, and this allows you to select lots of different things. So there's edge mode, there's vertex mode, and here's face mode. Those are the three I'm going to focus on. There's lots of other stuff in here we'll get to later on, but these three things, edge, vertex, and face, or object mode. So let's look at face mode first. So if I choose face, you'll see now as I roll over this cube, I don't get the whole object, I get each of these faces that kind of make up the object. So if I click on that and I scale, now I'm scaling just that side of the object. Whoa, now I'm getting into a crazy rhombus form, right? So things can get really interesting really fast. So I can scale up any of these sides, right? I can also click on a sphere. That guy's still in object mode. And as soon as I click off of it, it kind of went back to object mode. But it could work the same way if I choose face on the sphere. You see my sphere is actually made up of all these little polygon faces. So this is just something to understand about 3D. We have a mesh, and then they're connected together, and these faces create a solid polygonal object, right? And so these are just the faces. Again, as soon as I click off, I'm back in object mode. So I have to choose face again, and I can start to play. So not only can I scale it, but I can move those faces, just that face alone, or just that face, and move it up and down, or tilt it outward, and the rest of the object stays in place. Or I can rotate these planes as well, and now things can get really interesting, right? So you can take all of these things and give them different angles to them and different tilts, and you can start to create some really complex forms. And that's just face mode, right? If I hold down shift, I can get multiple faces. So now if I go back to scale, I'll scale both those faces together while the rest of the object stays the same size. Pretty neat. I can also choose an object like this, go to face mode, and I can use a lasso and kind of select more than one face at a time. And that's selected through the object. I'll show you later how to kind of select only parts of the object. I'm going to come down here to a front view like I have down here in the bottom left. And now I can right click on that and get a little bit more of the object, right? And so now I could scale just the top of that object. You can see how powerful that can get. I ended up changing my panel there real quick, so let me go ahead and go back to a front view on that. That'll help. So now I can scale and grab just that and scale that up, and if I choose my move tool, I can move that up, and very quickly I'm starting to get kind of a crazy spaceship rocket nose cone kind of shape to it, right? And you can move all these objects in all of their various dimensions and have a lot of fun with it and create some really complex forms. So that is just face mode, right? I'm going to go ahead and delete that object for right now. Now we'll just work with this round object. I'm also going to just kind of switch here so we can just focus on the one viewport. So now I'm going to right click on it and I'm going to choose edge next. So I can also choose just edges, right? And I can click around and I can grab an edge. And what happens when I move an edge? Well, just that edge comes out. Now I created like a sharp blade sticking out the side of the object, right? Which is a really great way to move parts of an object around. We'll talk about this again later, but if you hold down shift and double click an edge right next to an existing edge, it'll select a whole ring of edges. Now I can scale those out and create kind of a ring form. Whoop. There we go. Sorry, I hit a shortcut key by accident. Now I've got this little ring sticking out around it, right? Or I can hold down edge and hold shift and kind of, do each one separately one by one if I want to. It takes a lot of time to do that, so a lot of times you might just want to hold one, hold down shift and double click and it gets that whole ring like I said. Now I can scale that whole ring inward or outward, and get kind of a whole different kind of form and shape to it. Last thing I'm going to show you is Vertex Mode. This is where you can move individual points. So when I say points make a line and then lines connect to make a face, and then all those faces connect to make an object, they all work together, right? But it kind of just breaks down into all the various components that make up your object. So I can pull that one point out, or I can move it around in free space. Now I will warn you, if you start moving points around, I highly recommend you get into four-way view because you never know. Sometimes when you're getting used to how big a 3D space is, all of a sudden your points will be kind of crazy and way, way, way farther away than you think they are because you've only been looking in perspective view the whole time. So when you're doing this component-based modeling, it is really important that you switch to this four-way view every once in a while and just have a clear view of what you're working with, okay? So I know I spent a little bit of time there on that difference, but really spend some time with object, edge, and vertex mode and face mode. Now there is a multi-tool that kind of allows you to choose all of them from one. Some people like it, some people find it a little overwhelming, but you see all from one tool. I can choose an edge, I can choose a face, or I can choose a vertex. And like I said, sometimes it can be a little bit complicated to know what you're clicking on when, but other times when you're just doing quick little tweaks, it can be really, really helpful. So that's this multi-tool right here. So spend a little time right-clicking on your object, play with edge, face, vertex, object mode, and multi-tool, okay? All right. So as we have a complex object like this, we're going to want to be able to do some things to it a little bit more manually. So it's time to look at some of our menus over here on the right. So probably with the most important menu in your entire system here is the attribute menu in Maya. I had modeling toolkit up here first. We'll talk about that later. This also has, the modeling toolkit also has where you can go between object, vertex, edge, and face selection, or UV, which we'll talk about later in this course. So those are just some nice icons. If you don't like having to do the right click on the object to choose those, you can always bring up your modeling toolkit and know that you have those as well. But let's talk about attributes for a little while. So I'm going to go right click and go to object mode. You'll see the minute I click on, if I have nothing selected, nothing really shows up in the attribute editor. But if I click on this object, you'll see I have some panels that show up. So there's the attribute editor, and then each object kind of has sub panels underneath that, right? So there's the sphere object itself, the p-sphere shape, the polysphere one, and then there's some stuff about shaders, which we'll get to later. But this polysphere one has some really important stuff to it. And one of them is kind of the overall like size. You can control the radius of your object, right? Because this started out as a sphere. I can play around with the subdivision axis. This one isn't as handy. I rarely use that, but the subdivision heights, these kind of work together. But let's start off, instead of with a complex object like I have right here, sometimes it's easier to understand what's going on with a primitive. So I'm going to go ahead and delete that object, and I'm going to go ahead and bring a cube back in, right? So right off the bat, you know, I just showed you how to do sphere, edge, and vertex-based editing. That's great, but I'm going to stick with object mode here. I'm going to click on my polycube, and you'll notice when I click on polycube 1, and I haven't really like messed with it too much, I can subdivide this object. This is really important for creating more complex shapes as we go along. So this allows me to subdivide both X, Y, and Z on this object. So if I just leave it the way it was with just one each, if say I go to face mode, I only have one face to click on, right? But if I go back to object mode and I subdivide it a little bit, I could do 8, 8, and 8. And you can type these in, or you can use the little toggle bar there. Now, when I go back to face mode, here we go. Now I have all these extra subdivisions that I can work with, right? A lot more going on there. And this is also going to basically control how smooth your object can be. There are other ways to smooth it, but at least the initial smoothness of your object, is it kind of a rough shape, or is it a more smooth shape, right? I think maybe this, I think this maybe is a little more illustrated. Say if I bring in a disk. You see how if I look at this in the top view, it's a circle, but it's kind of a rough circle because it's only subdivided so much. If I take the poly disk and I up my subdivision, you can see the more I subdivide it, the smoother that outside edge becomes. It also gives me more faces to work with. Now, don't go crazy, because if you put too many in, whoa, that's a lot of faces to work with, and you're going to have the right tool to be able to manipulate them. Sometimes it's easier to control something when you have less points. It's also less taxing on the system, and it takes less render time to lower the subdivision. So again, on this guy, I can control its size, its radius, and all that stuff. I can also control kind of like the number of sides, a different way of how the subdivision works on that particular object. But I'm going to go back, say, to my cube here. So that polycube one, it's really important. Again, I can change its size here with height, width, and depth, or I can use the interactive tool that I showed you. I can subdivide it, which is really great. I don't have to do it in all the dimensions. I can just do it in 1 or in 2 and do 2 there. And it gives me a lot of control, right? There's a whole lot more in here we'll get to later, but I would just love for you to be able to control kind of the polycube one controls here of height, width, depth, and subdivisions, okay? The other thing here under polycube 1 as well, I can also dial in, I can scale various dimensions of this within the attribute editor. So I can hit 3 on that, and that's my X. That's moving in my X dimension, right? It's on the red. Or I can undo that or type it back to 0, or actually 1, which was the original there. And then I could do this as well in the Y dimension. I could say 2 and double that up. On the Z, I could type in 2. So you can dial in exactly how big you want it to be. Right now, this is all based on units of measure that are chosen. If you want to change those, you can go to Windows and Settings and Preferences, and go to Preferences, and I believe units of measure. Oh, I always get a little lost on where the units of measure are. Bear with me. That's what here we go. Working units. So it's clicking on the setting tab. Right now it's in centimeters. It might be easier for you to work in inches, feet, or yards. I'll go to inches and hit save. Now when I'm typing in here, I'm talking about inches that I'm working with, right? So how many inches do I want this to be within my space? I can bump this up to 3 inches, etc., etc. So working in the attributes editor, you have a lot of control here on what's going on, okay? The other thing I like to show is up here in the top, you can kind of turn on and off these various things. Like if I don't want to see my attribute editor, I can click that this little icon, which is just underneath the workspace menu, and now that's gone. Or I can turn it on if it happens to disappear. Same thing, if I don't want modeling toolkit, I can turn that off and it's gone, right? We're not going to work with character controls yet. That's a more advanced tool. And there are some tool settings that we can bring in as well for controlling tools, which is can work really well. I'm just dragging that in there so my tool settings are all in this panel if I want to see them. And then we also have what's called the channel box and layer editor. And I'm going to drag that in there so that in the future now, these all show up in the same area. Because for these objects and stuff, the channel box editor can be really powerful, as well as the attribute editor. So I like to have all those options available to me, as well as, say, the modeling toolkit. So if I click on channel box, oops, sorry, I double clicked it there. And I can drag this menu out a little bit to the left if I need to. So now I can play around with things as well. I can say type in 3 on the X, and that just moved my object in space. So if I need to move something a very specific increment, I'm going to take that back to 0. It's always going to start off in the center of your screen, this kind of like where everything meets, where the X and the Y and the Z kind of converge. So I can type in here, I can put it much lower, I can say 0.2, and it's only going to move my object 0.2 along the X plane. Or I could say I want this 3 inches on the Y plane, and if I look, it's way up in the air now. So maybe I didn't want 3, I wanted 0.3. So I'll type into that and say 0.3 inches. Now it's hovering just a little bit above that original ground plane, right? So again, the channel box editor is going to allow you to do that. You can also rotate objects in here with degrees. So I could say rotate 15 degrees on the X plane and it's going to tilt it. Or I could say 15 degrees on the Y plane. And you can kind of control it as you go. Maybe I didn't want it on the X to begin with. I only wanted it on the Y. And same thing, I can scale these objects X, Y, and Z up and down as well by various factors. So it's a really nice manual area. The channel box editor is an important thing to learn for kind of moving through controlling your object in space, both on scale, rotate, and translate. So whether you want to use the tools, the EWER, or you prefer to do things more manually in the channel box editor, that's where you're going to find them. So we've got channel box, attributes, and again, that's these icons up here at the top. There's the channel box editor, there's our attributes, and here is our modeling toolkit. Okay, remember that's where you can also have that shortcut to edge, vertex, or faces. So really get to know your modeling toolkit, at least from a beginner standpoint. We'll come back to that later. But the attributes and the channel box are really important to kind of get used to using on a regular basis. Let's see. Beyond that, we're also going to look at the outliner panel today. This is kind of a list of everything you've brought into your scene. So over here on the left, remember where I showed you guys you could switch between like single view, four-way view, or two-way view? Well, just below that, this is the hide or show the outliner button. And this is kind of a hierarchical list of everything that's in your scene. Right now I only have a cube in the scene, but watch what happens if I add a sphere. Boom. Now we see a sphere has been added to this, right? The default light set, don't ever delete these, or the default object set, or any of these cameras up here, because these are sort of default things. If you delete them, like if you deleted your light set, the scene's going to go black. You're not going to have any lights in the scene, and until you learn how to add lights, you want to make sure you leave these default objects in here. If you delete these cameras, you're no longer going to have a perspective view or a top view, and until you learn how to add a camera, that's kind of an important thing to have. So don't delete anything out of here. But, I can always select an object like the cube and then delete if I don't want it. I'm going to undo so that I have the cube and the sphere here, okay? So as you build out a more complex scene, this is going to be a really big list of stuff in here, which is great. You're going to be able to really explore and play around quite a bit. And we'll come back to this of how you can kind of organize this, but I'd like everybody to know that when you kind of lose track of objects, open up your outliner and you can find them here, and it's a great way to select them, particularly when you have like objects that are nested inside of other objects out there, okay? You can also middle click an object and drag it onto another object, and then it becomes kind of like a child of that object, which is kind of cool. So if I choose cube now, it'll choose the cube and the sphere together, and you'll see as I move it, they move together as one. But then I could just choose the sphere and still have the sphere as like the child of the parent. So like maybe this was like the joint of an arm or something like that I was working on, right? And I wanted to be able to move the whole thing together. Now it's easy because they can kind of be assigned together like that. When I move them, I can move or rotate or scale them all together, which can be very, very convenient moving forward. Again, if you want to middle click and drag, you can always drag that back out, and then the sphere is its own object, and the cube or kind of big rectangle form is its own object as well. All right, last thing I want to show you today, I'm going to close my outliner, and that's just kind of getting used to that there's a menu for the viewport. So this is our viewport. We have an object here. I could zoom way out on that object, and where's my object? Where's my object? Well, if I just went to my outliner and chose my cube, I could come here to view and say frame selection, or the shortcut key F on my keyboard. And boom, it will frame that object. It'll zoom in on it and find it for you. So this is really convenient as you lose track of things in 3D space, which all beginners do. This is a great way to frame it. So like I just chose the sphere. If I hit F again, it's going to zoom in and kind of center just on that. So this little set of submenus is your viewport menu system. There's lots and lots of stuff in here. So it's really nice to be able to know you can come in here and find different things that are going to help you kind of navigate your viewports more effectively. Frame all will frame everything in your scene. So maybe I have tons and tons of stuff in here, and it'll kind of frame the whole thing versus just F, which is going to frame that object, or F is going to frame whatever I have selected. I can always go up to View and say Frame All, and it'll come and give me the big picture of everything in my scene. So another great kind of shortcut to have there. The other thing I like to show you is shading modes. We can look at our objects with what's called smooth shade, which is what we're seeing now, so everything looks like it has a little bit of like light and shade to it, or I can look at it in wireframe mode. And I can just kind of see how the internal schematics work, and I can see how objects are intersecting with each other. Or I can go back to shade here and I can say smooth shade, selected objects only. So it's wireframe until I select something, and then that becomes smooth shade. There's also flat shade all, which sort of really shows you the polygonal quality of your objects. You don't really see it on the cube shapes, but on the sphere you can really see just how rough this cube is right now. Which is, if I take that cube and maybe I up its subdivision a bit more, it'll look a lot smoother. And the more I subdivide it, the smoother of a sphere it gets, right? And flat shading for selected only. So again, that's kind of like when I click on it, it becomes shaded. And then a bounding box, which I don't find very useful. It just gives you a box around the shape. So I'm going to go back and turn on smooth shade all. And then you have additional ones. You can turn wireframe on plus shaded. So now I can see the wireframe plus the shaded. I do this a lot when I'm just trying to keep track of my mesh and how things are intersecting. So that's a really good one to work with. There's also X-ray, where it's shaded but you can still kind of see through it. This is really handy when you have objects that are intersecting with each other. X-ray joints. I honestly don't know how that works. I don't use it very often. I'm going to turn X-ray joints off. Yeah, I think that's enough for right now. Well, later we'll get to what hardware texture does, but you don't need that right now. So I'm a big fan of X-ray and also wireframe on shaded. I think those two can be really helpful as you're working through it. And then let's see, the last thing I want to show you is just up here under panels. You can change any viewport. So even though I'm in the 4-way view right now, actually let me go to 4-way, I was in 2-way. I could say this does not have to be my perspective view. I could come up here to panels and say, no, I don't want this to be a perspective camera. I want it to be an orthographic camera. I want this to be my front view. And then this one, you can see it says front down in the bottom in little white text. And I want this one that's top view, I want that one to be my perspective. So then I would go to perspective and change that to perspective. And then maybe I want the old front one down here in the bottom left. I want that to be an orthographic as well. I want that to be my top view. So you can really customize where you want things to show up in these 4-way or 2-way views. And you do that again by choosing the viewport and then going to panels and choosing whether you want a perspective view or you want an orthographic view. Later down the road, I'll show you how to create a new camera, and then you'll be able to select them underneath perspective. But for right now, you can work with perspective or the various orthographic views. Okay? That's it for my introduction to Maya. We're going to stop there for today. And you have a few homework assignments to do, so please check out homework assignment number 1 and number 2. They build off of what I just showed you and show you a few more features. Please do get in touch via email, or we can set up a Zoom session and I can help you through this further. Hope you enjoy playing with Maya.